All right, good evening. We will be calling the meeting to order of the Water and Sewer Committee. It is April 22nd. The time is 6:02 p.m. And I don't know what else I do now. So we're here to discuss the feasibility study for the water plant expansion. So we will begin the conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Paul Roman to take it from here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And a lot of what I have tonight is really just working off of the ordinance that we had presented last week. And it's really to have some other experts in the room. Doug Wagner's here from the water treatment plant, and Joe Swartz is from Arcadis. I think right off the bat, just like I mentioned last week, we did see qualification statements for this feasibility study, and Arcadis was determined to be most qualified. And just like we've talked before, when you hire consultants, you pick the most qualified and you work out a scope of services and then a cost. And if council recalls, last year we did a rate study, and part of the rate increases last fall was to include funding this feasibility study, as well as designs and to start putting money into the revenue stream to go towards an expansion. And we were just really following through on that. There was money allocated in the budget for this feasibility study. As I mentioned last week, I think there's several reasons that I feel a study is needed in terms of capacity. When you look at future expansions, you're not really looking at your average demand. You're really looking at your peak demands. Obviously, it's those emergencies that you worry about. Oregon, for the last couple of years, we've had some wet years, and 2020 was probably the last really dry year. And in that year, we did hit a peak demand of 13.5 MGD, and our plant capacity is 16 MGD. And that was literally 4 years ago. My concern is if you get another drought, some of the current customers that we have, the methanol plant, the OCE power plant, they are using more potable water or water, regular water. And even Synovus, that I thought for sure was behind because of their accident from a year before with BP Husky, and then just how things worked out last year. So again, my concern is just that all it takes is a dry summer, and even when we hit that 13.5, that's not like with a fire. That's just a very dry summer, and your demand is high. I don't know if any of council remembers when I first started. I think Doug, I think you were an operator at the time as well. So I became a service director in 1999, but in 98 we had water restrictions, and you pretty much were begging people to restrict their water use, and it wasn't easy. We're saying every other day use, and I remember when I became service director, I got chewed out because the street department wanted to go water trees, and I stopped them because there was actually a couple people, actually farmers, were asking for meters, and we said no in terms of irrigating, and we were asking people to restrict their water use, and it was getting difficult. And in those times, there were about 3 or 4 years, really dry summers. Again, we were planning an expansion at the time, but it wasn't there yet. What we would do is hook up BP Husky to Toledo Water. So we would isolate them, and we would have to pay Toledo for that upcharge. Their costs have always been higher than ours. And I know that's always available to us, but I really don't want to go back to those days. I think it's good for us to be independent. I think when you talk to the EPA about asset management, they want to know where you're at with your demands and want to know that you're certainly planning for water line replacement. They like redundancy, and certainly we've told them about the expansion in our last rate study, and they were glad that we're working towards that. But so there is certainly the capacity side, but then there's the water quality side. And as we mentioned last week, EPA has come out with new regs for the polyfluoroalkyls alcohols, chemicals, the chemicals that don't disappear. They say they're really a waste product from waterproofing industry, cosmetics. I think the Lake Erie area, or with Detroit, wasn't really well known as an area that had any large industrial producers of PFAS, but that doesn't mean you won't see them in the lake system, and that's just a concern. So that is out there, and I just think that we know in recent past few months we've had people asking about scale as an issue, and I know council, you try to do your best and try and answer, and we tried to provide as much information as we could on it, and it gets difficult sometimes. But I think when looking at a plant expansion, we also have to look at the best treatment. And I think that's extremely important. I think with ozone, we definitely were a leader in the way we went and using ozone to really oxidize or destroy algae. But at the same time, we know the PFAS and other things are out there that we need to plan for. But one of the ideas of this plant expansion is to look at reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is really pressurizing your water through a membrane, and it's probably the best way to filter. There is some money involved, power to use pumps to push it through the membrane, but it does remove minerals, which leads to scale. And so that has a use, but it's also one of the most effective ways of dealing with PFAS. And so it is an expensive process, but I think it's something we really need to look at. Part of the plant expansion is just not just the treatment side of it. There's also the raw water supply. As I mentioned last week, it's wrong to not, and by the way, when you do a feasibility study, the study itself is used for your loan application. So when you go and apply, they need to know that you looked at every alternative available. You've done your analysis of whatever you're selecting, and there was a process. So this study is required, especially if you're going to finance it with an EPA loan. Okay, but on the raw water side, when we talked about this, one of the alternatives would be, should you purchase raw water from Toledo? If you don't know our water plant layout, Toledo's raw water lines go right across our site. And they have chambers right there on North Curtis Road that I believe we could tie into. Toledo knows we have that interest. I've talked to them before about just getting an emergency connection. I think as a minimum, that's something we need to do. But the question is, do we build a second low service force main, or do we simply buy water from Toledo, or do we still build the force main but still have an emergency connection? And I think that's likely the case. But I think, again, just for the analysis, we have to do that. And there's a lot of cost to that work. There's a lot of study. I can tell you when we looked at ozone, we were also providing raw water to the power plant, OCE. And when we looked at the cost of another force main, and that was probably in 2015 or so, that cost was around $9 million. I'm sure it's up there now. It's probably 13, 14 million at this point. That's just a force main, to run raw water, let alone a plant expansion. So I think it's important to look at the alternatives, and I think redundancy is extremely important in terms of having an emergency connection. But it does raise the question: would we be better off just purchasing raw water? Toledo's certainly aware of what we're looking at, and they are planning a third line themselves. And I made them aware that, hey, as a minimum, we would have interest in an emergency connection. But it's possible we would look possibly to purchase raw water at some point. So they're well aware of it. In regard to then so there's really three parts to this feasibility study. The water treatment plant is the main portion of the study. It is looking at other technologies such as reverse osmosis. One thing I also want to mention about reverse osmosis is that we have lime softening at the water plant. We pretty much matched what City of Toledo has done for years. I know in talking with Doug, we think they were using lime softening more for the glass industry. And we don't have glass industry here. It's a question, should we still be following their lead when we're pretty much taking the lead on many other subjects? We do question that, but the beauty to reverse osmosis is it could, by simply removing the minerals, you'd be basically providing your own softening. I don't know if I'm saying it right, Doug, you can always correct me, but the idea is reverse osmosis could take place of lime softening. So not only you're not adding lime, you're also not dealing with spent lime. If you recall, in our just our analysis of chemicals as well as what our operating expenses are, spent lime removal is around 1.1 million every year. And lime purchases are close to another, what, 500, 600,000, Doug? I mean, it got eight. So we're really spending close to 2 million just to lime soften and get rid of the spent lime. So looking at reverse osmosis, I know it's an expensive treatment process, but it could actually reduce our operating costs. Now, you'd have electrical costs for the reverse osmosis, but I think you may be able to offset that without having to deal with spent lime. So there's definitely some trades there. So getting back to the breakdown, there is the water plant, the expansion portion. Mrs. Pauloff, you had asked, hey, do we got room for it? We literally have a green field next to our site that is almost the same size as our current plant. You could literally build the mirror image to the west of the plant to suffice for that. So in addition to the water plant and the raw water, it is the distribution system. Couple things. We have expanded our system. We've added the Lollendorf Road storage tank. We needed to do that with the additional expansion that we had done last time. It was required by the EPA. We have provided more water to a lot of areas of the city, more pressure, but even our southwest quadrant still needs more pressure, and that's something we need to think about. We've also had calls and discussions with our outside customers. Genoa, as well as Northwest Sewer District, are looking for more water. Genoa, I've had more discussions with, and at one point, they are trying to market their area for industry, and I get that, you know, if it's something that's competing between us and Genoa, we wouldn't necessarily provide that water, but at the same time, if there's something that they can get and they need more water, I think it's something we need to consider providing that water. We do get a surcharge of 50%, and keep in mind that surcharge, if anyone questions this on a surcharge, we have income tax going into our rates. So our inside ratepayers are paying income tax. Well, income tax is being paid, let's put it that way, as well as the rate itself. So when we charge that surcharge outside customers, they're not giving us income tax. That's what that surcharge makes up for. So just remember that. But regardless, Genoa is definitely looking for more water. Northwest Sewer District is definitely looking for more water. And then TRC has come to us in the past and asked us if they could come to us versus Toledo. I'm not out to get a Toledo customer, but at the same time, the bulk of TRC is in Oregon. It is Toledo's biggest water customer. And I'm not necessarily saying I'm doing this to get TRC, but I think it's something we need to consider when they've come to us in the past to see if we could serve them. I think it is something we need to study. We do have lower rates, and I think with the bigger water users, it's not just the subsidy, but even with the bigger water users that we have, it's what keeps those rates down. So beyond all that, I'm expanding from what we talked about last week for tonight, but my real goal was just to answer any questions that anybody has regarding this. I think at this point where our peak demands are, it is something I've talked with EPA several times. They're glad that we are looking towards an expansion. It is only prudent to do that at this time. You certainly don't want to be at your max design and you're now behind and you're hooking up to Toledo to get by. So, which you can do, but I'm just telling you, it's not the responsible way of dealing with this. So I'd open it up, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if anyone has any questions and,
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Roman. Appreciate that. Anyone have any questions, council committee?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roman, on the first page of our ordinance today, I just want to go over the funding of the potential study. It's $670,000. We provided $300,000 in our budget for
Correct.
this, so it's an additional $370,000 about up and beyond what we had anticipated, correct?
That's correct. And the 300,000 was a guess, just so you know. and
Yep,
it's
something
Something
a
you're-
placeholder.
That's
Okay,
correct.
we didn't know for sure.
That's correct.
What type of time frame would we have on this type of study before we could have information that could be used for grant applications?
Yeah, I think, and Jeff, you can always add to this. It really was for us to have, it started at this point, the hope would be to have something by January of 25 is the hope to have that. And I think at that point, you have a good sense of what alternatives you want to pick, what certainly treatment, and then it is a question of design. January is ideal because when you go to apply for water loans, that's usually at the end of February. And this is something where it's so big that we may need a loan just for design. Because usually, I'm just telling you something, even, and just, I'll back up a little bit. When we were talking about what do you expand to, it is a question, how much further do you go? I don't want to go to 6 MGD and have, 9 MGDs sitting out there forever. I think and even the EPA, they'll question you on that, but I think just the cost alone is going to be almost double or triple from what our last expansion was. Now, our last expansion to go from 8 to 16 was about 20 million. In today's dollars, that's going to be closer, to 50 million, just for 8 MGD, let alone 16. So when you look at the engineering fees are usually 10% of that value. So it's still a big dollar amount. So part of our rate structure, I put money in so that, if it goes that route, if it's just getting money for design, that's part of that rate structure, to collect revenue for that now, the plan for that.
And then if we were to move forward after the design process, after considering 8 or 16 MPGs, we're looking at a build out of something like this in 2026, 2027,
Yep.
before we're online, probably 27.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Mr. Wallensack, I think that it'll come down to grants and loans, OPWC, and what their funding rounds are, as well as getting loans. So when you add that in, it adds more time.
Sure.
I think it'd be more like by 28, going to
Be
29.
operational.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's something you definitely have to plan for and definitely use it to your advantage to get any infrastructure grant dollars, anything available, from the government as well for this. It's just a lot of planning, and if you do it in phases, it adds more time, certainly, and that can be a killer. That's what we did last time. We did it in 5 phases, and it seemed crazy. But we did take advantage of OPWC by getting the most grant dollars when we did that.
Thank you, Mr. Roman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Wallensack and Mr. Roman.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Ms. Pauloff.
been trying to wrap my head around the 600 and some $1,000
Yeah.
for this feasibility study.
Mhm.
So it's going to go from the crib intake all the way to someone's house. That's going to be that's pretty much the whole feasibility study. So if we're almost doubling if we're going through from 16 to 32.
Well, you would be.
Right, we're doubling, so are we looking at, we're gonna have to upgrade ozone, we're gonna have to upgrade, I mean, if needed, we're gonna have to add more
Yeah,
to that, so
when we put
that's
ozone in-
astronomical to me.
Yeah.
Because ozone itself was what, how many millions?
Ozone was 16 million.
So you look at that, and if we have to double in size, I mean, even looking at the intake crib, I mean, are we gonna have to change that?
We did design ozone to go to 24 MGDs, just so you know. So we did put a little bit more capacity in the
So we're looking
ozone.
at going up by 8 mgd.
Yeah, if you just went to 8, it's likely ozone could suffice. But again, this reverse osmosis, some of that could take the place of ozone. I mean, reverse osmosis is that good of a system, and I think it's something we
Well, that
really
won't
need.
replace the ozone, will it?
Well, it's possible. It could be worked with ozone, if not replace it. Yes.
And how long has reverse osmosis been out compared to ozone?
I think it's out been for a while, but it's probably the most expensive system. And that's why I always
Right, and we
question it.
thought that ozone was the most expensive system.
Yeah. No, I think, and ozone was the proper way of going. And it's still, it's a tool that you have in your box that you can apply. And any one of these things that we can do, it isn't like, even with reverse osmosis, it could be, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, it could work with any other treatment system. It doesn't, so you have your existing plant as well that can operate just as it is, and have a second plant come on for another, let's say another 8 MGD, have a whole nother treatment process put together, blend it.
And Mr. Chair, if I could have one more
Yep.
question?
Sure.
So if we were to look at osmosis, are we looking at an uptick in the chemicals that we already use? Or is it gonna be lower? Because we didn't think we were gonna need the chemicals for the
It-
ozone, but now with osmosis, are we gonna still be needing those?
Well, I think reverse osmosis, I think it's really just the additional power to pump it through a membrane. It isn't so much the chemicals. Now, it strips the water of everything. It takes minerals, everything out. And I think it may even lower the pH, which, if you're doing it in lieu of lime softening, you still might need to add lime just to raise your pH. So yeah, I think, no, it won't be adding more chemicals for reverse osmosis. It's the additional power. And I think you need to use some of your finished product, run it back through the system. So there's kind of you're wasting some of the product as well to go back through that. You're actually may even be adding minerals just to give minerals to the water at some point with it. So it's not the solve all, and I'm not saying it's the way to go, but I'm saying it'd be wrong not to study it. It definitely is known to deal with treatment with PFAS, and I think that's something I think we need to study it regardless.
Well, no, I agree. I think we do need to study it, and if it's going to reduce a chemical with osmosis, that'll take down a lot of those calcium deposits that are in everybody's line and giving everybody a headache right now.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind,
Yep.
I just the breakdown of that 670,000, 406,000 was for the actual plant expansion, which is probably the bulk of the study. But there's 137,000 to look at the raw water supply, and there's some modeling with that, and there's definitely some hydraulics that has to be looked at. And then even with the water distribution, that itself is also a computer model. We actually established that model in, I think, 2005. Is that right, Jeff? And we've used it for sizing the Lallendorf Road tank. We've used it to look at we actually looked at providing Toledo water to the second power plant, if you recall. That hasn't happened. I don't know if that will happen. But that went into that design, was using that model. But again, if Genoa or someone else is asking for more water, that's something you'd want to run it through the model. If we were to provide water to TRC, again, we'd need to run that through the model. I mean, it's some work. There's some details to it. So there is cost. That's why it's there. That's all.
Thank you very much. Councilman, any other?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Reeves.
thank you. I have a question, but I don't know how to ask it. Mr. Roman, do we have the facility to expand where we're at? And I'm not sure how to ask part two, but it's something about the feasibility. I'm confused at why we need the feasibility study if we know that we need to have this stuff. I'm just confused. I mean, it's like if I need to do something at home, I just do it. I don't have to have somebody come out and give me a study over it. I just, if, I don't I mean, could you, I have no idea how to ask it.
No, it's a real good, well, I understand your question. And
I'm glad you
no,
do.
number one, we do have the land available. And clearly, I think when our water plant was first planned out, which was the early 60s, they bought enough land almost to go to 32, if not more than that. But I know they had originally bought the land to be at least 32 MGD. So we definitely have the land available. If we run a new parallel line with the low service force main, and when I say low service, that's our pump intake out on Yondota Road. It's possible you may need some more easements to build a second line, but you would try to get as much of it in the original easements that's there now. When we talk about feasibility studies in engineering, when it's this magnitude, and it is a question of new science, there's actually I don't know what we need is the reality. And that's why you need a feasibility to figure out what are the alternatives and what would be the best for us is the question. And there's the question of money as well as a science, you know.
Mhm.
When we use the word feasibility study, it also includes a preliminary design. So not only are you trying to pick out what you think is best for us and looking at all alternatives available, you're also then doing a preliminary design where you're sizing the equipment or getting a rough idea of what everything would cost. And once we have that, then we're using that information to go get loans and grants. So the real ask is, hey, how much would this cost if I wanted to go another 8 MGD? Well, it's kind of hard to say. Well, they say, well, what kind of technology do you want? Do you want the same that you have, or do you want to look at? So there's all these questions that go into that cost estimate, which you correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff. I think sometimes doing a detailed cost estimate for something that's already designed is a hell of a lot easier than a preliminary design, because you don't know, there's so many unknowns, and you don't even know if it'll work. So the feasibility is really just figuring out what will work best with our water and our condition and for what our needs are. And then once you do that, then I'm asking them also, which is included in this, is to do a preliminary design. The detailed design, you pretty much know what you're planning to do. It's now just the details to lay it out. So yeah, the answer to your question is I don't know exactly. I know we need to expand, but I don't know exactly to which technology. And should we switch is the bigger question. You know, what does that cost to switch? I'm not saying reverse osmosis is the best, but I know it's expensive, but I know it does a hell of a job in filtering out. So we've always questioned the cost and whether that would work for us. But when I heard that it could take the place of lime softening, and knowing that our cost is sky high for spent lime removal, I think it's something to look at. I think we need to look at it. So hopefully that answers your question. I know it's hard when you hear feasibility study and you think another study. It's more than that. It really is an analysis of all the technologies that are available. And by the way, you got to do this. The EPA will make you do this no matter what. So if you apply for a loan, they're going to say, hey, can we see your feasibility study? You better show that you did it.
Okay.
All right.
That,
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Reeves.
thank you. I mean, that clears it up to some degree for me. It's just, you know, I've always been, you know, you want to build it, you know, without wasting, and I don't mean to say it's a waste, spending the money on having somebody else take care of it when we believe we know what we're looking for. I mean, that's the same thing like doing you know, like I complain about the add-ons and stuff like that come. So, you know, I just that 670,000 just seems pretty high in my mind.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Reeves, it is culture shock when you see these prices. I know Jeff knows I go into culture shock every time I see a price. but in all reality, when you look at inflation and everything else, engineering costs have also gone up through the years. And it's out there. And I think when you look at the details, and if you look through their scope, there is a lot of details here that need to be looked at. And it all takes time at an engineer's rate. So, yeah, it is sticker shock. And I've had that 300,000 in our budget probably for 3 or 4 years. And, you know, until you get qualification statements to know what you got, you really don't have a true number. But so like Mr. Wallenczak says, you have a placeholder. And I knew there'd be other costs. I did, in our rate study, I did say, hey, part of that revenue is allocated for this design. And that would include this feasibility study as well. So.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead, Mr. Reed.
thank you. Mr. Roman, I'm not trying to give you a big head, but I think we have the best engineering department that, I mean, in the area, if not in the state of Ohio. That's why it sort of bothers me to a certain degree that we have somebody else, other engineers taking a look at it. But I know you guys have so much on your plate that, I mean, it'd be extremely difficult to do. It's just, I'd rather us keep the money in-house
Yeah.
to have, and I know it would be extremely difficult to do. You know, I've told you that before, you know, when we've talked about other buildings and things like that. I don't like spending our taxpayer money when we can be using it in
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
That's
Well,
just my opinion on it.
no, and I appreciate that, Mr. Reeves. Just keep in mind that, like, between me and Rodney, and us being professional engineers, part of our PE is to really practice in what we know, you know, and when I came here, I really was a drainage engineer, and I did a lot with water lines and sewers. So I tend to stick more with the water distribution side and sanitary sewers. If you notice, we do a lot of that work in-house, and that's under my PE, and that's our expertise. We also do a lot of road design in-house,
Right.
because that's under Rodney's PE, and that's his expertise. So we do save by doing engineering in-house, but treatment is a whole nother game. I mean, water treatment is not my background. I actually had some engineering background in wastewater, but even that, I wouldn't preach that I know wastewater to the degree of thinking I can design in-house. And we really shouldn't be, even as a PE, we really shouldn't design things in-house unless it really is our expertise. So that's important, especially when you stamp it. You're saying, you know the subject, you know the design, you've done it, blah, blah, blah. So I appreciate your comments, but when it comes to treatment, we usually hire that out because that's not our expertise.
Mr. Chair, one more question, please.
Yep.
It's really not a question, it's a statement. I am in full support of this. I just, like you called it sticker shock.
Yeah.
You know, of what we paid back, a few years ago. But I do understand about inflation and that, but it just seems, and I don't want to call it a waste. It just seems like it's very, using the term that Ms. Paul is astronomical. But, like I said, I am in full support of this, so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Thank you, Ms. Roman. Council, any other questions or?
Mr. Chair.
Oh, yes, go ahead, Ms. Paul.
Thank you.
Pull your mic
No, I get,
closer.
oh, sorry, Terry.
And I'm next to you.
I know, I'm sorry. So I get why we need the feasibility study. I totally understand it. How much of this is going to involve working with this feasibility study and the EPA?
It's actually hand in hand in terms of figuring out exactly what the EPA would require. Obviously, Arcadis has that knowledge, but even when you're going through this study, you are trying to understand what PFAS, again, that'll be a new reg that starts in 27. You need, anything over 4 parts per trillion, you'll have to report. I'm sure as time goes on, there will be a hit, and as it is, it'll be what's your plan to deal with it, especially if you're over 4. I think, you're definitely, every time we get a loan, we have to go through our asset management plan. which we have every water line pipe, every valve, every hydrant, every piece of equipment. We have it documented in our asset management plan. We know the age when we need to replace it. Andrea has a long laundry list of water lines we need to replace. But every time we go for a loan, we have this asset management screening, and it's very difficult. It's a pain in the butt, but we go through it every time. And we also have these sanitary reviews that get conducted by the EPA, where they just go through our water plant, and Doug loves it when they do it. And they go through everything that we have, and they want to make sure that everything we're doing is proper. But when we have all these meetings with EPA, we do discuss everything we're doing. They're well aware. They were certainly after us to do the rate study. They clearly, it has to be done every 3 years. We were beyond that, and they gave us an extension, and we got that done. But I think at the same time, there's certain things that they expect that we're doing. And when it comes to just, having proper redundancy, sustainability, they need to know you're planning for any replacements or expansions. And we've said that over and over to them. I think this is just us proceeding with what we said would do, but it's directly in line with them. And we'll go through this. Every time you apply for a loan, they'll have an engineer that goes through just the design. That's your PTI design study. They'll go through everything on the technology side, and then we go through the finance side with the loan officers. So you go through that for every EPA loan. So
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, one more
Okay,
question.
one more than that.
So how many, now I know that we're still paying for ozone. How much longer on whatever loans that we have for this water treatment expansion? How many old loans do we have that we're still?
Like ozone and all the original plant expansion's been paid off, usually 20-year loans. Okay, so, and that was paid off a couple years ago. In ozone, I think we started in 2015. I think it goes to 2034 maybe. So yeah, usually they're 20-year loans. And again, if you get the grant, that's the best.
But how many are we right now?
Yeah, actually the best, it's a really good question. And I say this to all of you on council. When you look at your budget book, look at the debt schedule in the back. It'll list every loan that the city has and what the interest is and the year that you pay it off. You'll see that. And you'll see the funds that it applies to. So 340 is usually sewer, 320 is water, but you'll see that full listing of every loan. And, there's storm projects, they're all in that debt schedule. And you'll see exactly what our debt is at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paula. Ms. Ackerman, you had a question?
Mr. Chairman, Paul, I was wondering, what is the status of the, I want to call it a retention pond, it'd be a heck of a retention pond, the reservoir that Toledo purchased property for, do you know? I mean, is that, I've heard that they purchased the property and then they discovered that all of the major joints or fittings or whatever, now they have to spend money going in and upgrading their, what's the proper word, fittings? I'm not sure.
Well, I can give you my opinion, and that's all it really is. I've told Toledo over and over, they should have never offered to do the reservoir. They thought, just like, as I mentioned with the EPA, they want to know that you have alternatives and backup plans and so on and all that. So if you went through an experience where the lake had bad water, what would be your alternative? And when the EPA asks questions like that, they're thinking groundwater source or some water from another watershed. They're never thinking in the same watershed. To build that reservoir is just like another lake. I mean, the reality is that if that reservoir is not covered, it's going to be no different conditions than the lake itself.
Worse.
Oh, well, I mean,
Or algae.
let's face it, algae, fish eggs, they're all on the bird's feet when they land in the reservoir. And so I've said over and over, I said that if you're having problems in the lake, you're gonna have the same problems in that reservoir. You're gonna spend all that money on that when you have all these water lines to replace and all you think about all the infrastructure that Toledo needs to deal with, and they're gonna put their money in this reservoir, and it's gonna have the same condition as the lake. I mean, I've talked to them over and over. I said, I'd backpedal big time. And I think really what occurred was, well, they said they'd do it, they gotta do it, and they bought the property. And they can always tell the EPA, well, we bought the property, we're still planning, we're still thinking. It could still happen. I get it. You know, if they had a physical problem with their intake and they needed a couple days supply and their intake was cut off, yeah, it could be used for that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have a mini reservoir out at our low service pump station, and it's there so that when we deal with frazzle lice, you know, when the intake starts to freeze, right when that water's just about to, the lake is about to freeze over, there's a couple days you go through this period where the ice forms on the bell of our inlet and it forms like a giant snowball, plugs the line. And when that happens, the idea is you take your reservoir out at low service and you backfeed the water, and that snowball pops out for a little while and you start going again and you keep doing it till the lake freezes over. And when it's done, you're done. And, you know, thank God that's only happened to us a couple times. Doug's been with me, and it's not fun and it's actually scary. But you know, they plan for that. That's proper use of a reservoir. But Toledo's idea was more for algae, and I just don't. And that's actually before they put in ozone. You know, so now they got ozone. It's like I don't think they're going to build that reservoir. I'm just telling you, I just don't think they're going to build it. And I just think if I'm them, I'd be spending on water line replacements way before I build that. So that's my opinion.
I was just wondering in terms of like, are we looking, if Toledo was gonna undertake refitting like those lines or even replacing them
Oh,
from the intake, were they
okay.
gonna be looking to be buying water from
Yeah,
the
I
city
see
of
what you're saying.
Oregon?
So yeah, your question on the refitting was relining. So whether they're going to rehab their raw water lines. And it is a question of, you know, I think they want to build a big third line in between the two so that they can take one out of service at a time or line it or do whatever. And originally when they were looking at that reservoir, it was on Grottel's property in Jerusalem Township. And the ask they had for us is, would we be willing to fill it up for them using our low service? Well, one of the ideas I had, I said, well, we could do that, but if we do that, I'd like a connection to your raw water lines for emergency backup. And that would be the barter exchange was my ask. Well, that never came to fruition. And I think where these water lines cross the city and where they buy land, you know, I don't know whether they need a pump system to pump it up into that reservoir and what other planning, but they are definitely planning to line their lines. And they're definitely planning to build a third line in between them. And I think when they do that, I said, hey, when you build that third line, we would be looking for an emergency connection at North Curtis at the water plant. And so they know we're thinking that. They'll probably come to us for money, but I think it's something we need to look at. You know, you need redundancy for our system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ackerman. Thank you, Mr. Roman. We've got about 15 minutes left here before our next meeting. So anything further from any other questions?
Mr. Chair,
Yep, go ahead, Mr. Drake.
I don't know if Paul can answer this. I'm sure Doug can. If the city does decide to go to the reverse osmosis, you still have to use lime? Because I know right now you guys currently use lime, correct?
You would probably still have to use lime because reverse osmosis takes everything out of the water. So you would, and to do that, it would go to the pH or regulated by the EPA to maintain a certain level of pH in the water exiting the plant. So inevitably, you would still have to raise that pH back up. Right now, we do it with caustic soda, but lime would also be a good.
It wouldn't be as much lime as lime softening, but you would still have to increase it. See, and you got to remember, so when we talk before about scale, we talked about keeping the pH high. That's what EPA prefers us to do, if not literally require. We've asked them to lower our pH and they've said no. We do add a polyphosphate to line, to line it. And at the same time, the water already has minerals in it. That's your composition of scale. That's the problem. But even if, I think no matter what we do, you would have to do a corrosion study. So for whatever you're proposing to do, if it's something different than what you're doing now, you'd have to do a corrosion study to prove that you're not going to corrode the pipes. That's what happened to Flint. They didn't do a study, so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Drake and Ms. Roman. Council, anything further? No? All right, then we look for seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and second?
Second.
All right, motion and a second, so our meeting is adjourned.